Genshin Impact fans don't read. I think this isn't the first time we've heard of this in the Genshin community when talking about the people that have questionable perceptions of the lore despite canon material disproving it. Traveler's Minor. Interpretation is something that we, as humans, have innately based on biases, perceptions, and literacy. But today, I wanted to actually know how much do Genshin Impact fans actually read and play about their lore. And that's what I did. I surveyed over 4,000 Genshin Impact players regarding how they like their lore, what they think about the lore, and how they share the lore with others. And today, I'm going to be sharing the results of that survey. So buckle up because this is going to be a very long video. Thank you to the Aster that probably did the intro for this video. So today, welcome to Aster Presents, the different findings and the different interesting things that I found while doing this survey. So, welcome to Genshin Impact Fans Don't Read, a survey on lore exposure, consumption, and dissemination of Genshin Impact fans. And this is the results in the discussion portion of the survey. Thank you all so much for participating. I never thought that I'd be able to mess around and play with a sample size of 4,259. And if you're interested in my methodology, I guess, like my thought process behind the actual creation of the survey and how I did my analysis, a little scuffed behind the scenes video, I'll have that probably immediately after the posting of this video. So anyway, let's begin with what is this survey actually about. So what I wanted to know was how Genshin Impact fans read their lore, what they think about it, how they form their opinions about it, and how they share those opinions about their lore with others. What I wanted to know is what kind of medium does Genshin Impact fans consume the most, and what year category actually has the most amount of quote-unquote lore experience, or if there's just nothing. So that's what I wanted to know about, just the different kinds of nuances when people say that you don't read Genshin lore. I want to know if that's true. And obviously surveys are, you answer them by yourself. So there's always going to be a problem with you actually overestimating or underestimating your ability, but it's completely fine. So first is, who did this survey? What is the profile of the sample size that I got? Now, a lot of people were actually worried that what if the sample size that you got was mainly diluted into Genshin lore? With the sample size of 4,059, you'd think that that's not possible, but that's actually very possible in a quantitative research. But the average adventure rank that I got is AR 60. And the frequency is really interesting. So I only had 6 people that only played Genshin Impact recently in 2024. Shout out to you starting Genshin Impact this early. And then most the people here started at 2020 and then 2021, and then it's surprisingly cut in half, like nearly cut in half in 2022. That is very interesting, but that's gonna be important later. And then I asked, how long do you play Genshin Impact daily? So the frequency of this is most people play around 30 minutes to an hour, which most of the time it's probably just commissions and then the extra stuff on exploration. And some people play for 1 hour to 4 hours, which is 33% of the 100%. And to the people that play more than 8 hours, I hope you're streamers. Like, I really, really hope you're streamers. You make up the 0.4% of... But what's interesting about this is that distribution is significant. And now we move on to what's the most popular way people read lore. So Arc and Quest, always. A lot of people say that, you know, you're always supposed to play Genshin Impact. The fact that it is not a perfect 4. It was a scale of 0 to 4, which is never, occasionally, sometimes, often, and always. So this means that the higher the number of the bean, the higher the frequency of if it's played or not by the person. And then standard deviation just means the variety of the answers. Those are just the meanings of these numbers, but don't worry. Arc and Quest is relatively high. Character stories and profile stories are actually not as high as I thought that it would be. I think it's because people tend to go to characters that they like, and then other units they just don't. So that's interesting. Character story quests are also super high. World quests are higher than I thought that they were, because a lot of people actually commented on Genshin Impact's world quests not being voiced. But then we move on to the more obscure ones. Limited time events are obviously, you know, your go-to for the lore. And then we get to the in-game storybooks, artifact lore, and the more obscure ones that are hidden in the archive. This one is bordering on occasionally to never. So you have in-game storybooks only costed 1, and then artifact lore was 1.14, and then weapon lore was 1.06. I'm sorry. Monster lore is 1.12, and a lot of people usually said that they never touch those. Web lore events have proven to be the weakest of lore sources that people go to. And when I say web events, it's like, you know how Genshin Impact usually has those like little snippets, the ones that were accused of using AI. Yeah, those are the ones that I'm talking about. Event live streams are actually lower than I thought that they would be, because I would always think that people are excited for the event live streams. Like, even if you don't catch it immediately, you can just watch it as a VOD. So the fact that it's not a 3 point something is really interesting for me. Do people just not watch live streams? Other supplementary material are the promotional stories on Twitter, Facebook, and HoYoLab. They're basically just sneak peek that you get for the character, and because like the only things that you get is like a little snippet from Twitter, the real lore is in Facebook and HoYoLab. So that's interesting, but it is a standard deviation of 2, which means that the answers are really far apart. Then we move on to the secondary sources, which are the non-official media that you guys consume the most. There was a lot of answers actually. If you remember the survey, if you did it, there was another question there that just says, oh, do you guys have other lore sources that I may not have included here? And then I specifically said primary, but everyone started putting in secondary sources, so I wonder what went through their mind when they saw this next section. Secondary sources are actually significantly much more popular than primary sources, and this is especially true for the second part of this. For example, like these are just bordering on ones. The moment that we get to secondary sources, you can see that the numbers have shot up to be very, very high. So I guess that because of the convoluted nature of Genshin's lore, obviously it's lore, a lot of people just like the more condensed versions that we, the YouTubers, give out, right? Long-form content and short-form content, interestingly, have now the same mean. Let me just reconsolidate this real quick. So here's how I actually do it. So it's this descriptive analysis and frequency. You can see that I was in the process of doing it. So this one was short form content and then long form content. I want to see if the mean is actually the same. Look at just look at all of that. Jesus. Oh, it is the same. Oh, look at that. The most popular lore media from amongst all the samples was Arcane Quests, obviously. I think everyone is required to play the Arcane Quest at the very minimum to actually play Genshin Impact. These numbers justify the idea that everyone mostly gets their lore from voiced and character stories, right? The reason that not a lot of people are invested in the non-voiced and the non-character stories, and the least popular lore media is obviously the web events, the in-game storybooks, and the lore items, which... Next is, how trustworthy do people think the secondary sources are? So people have stated that they're somewhat too neutrally trustworthy amongst all of the sample, which is... I'm surprised that you guys have a lot of trust in these secondary sources. The thing about secondary sources is that we have a lot of interpretation, so my hypothesis was that it was going to be a bit lower, around like somewhat trustworthy to not at all trustworthy. But the fact that it's neutrally trustworthy actually means a lot that it's this high, quote unquote, because the maximum number is 4, right? So 2.26 is bordering the middle of it. So that's interesting. I'm actually Next, I wanted to see if there was a difference between I wanted to see if there was a difference in how they consumed their lore. So I did a one-way ANOVA, and this is what I got. Pretty solid. Which is interesting. I'm actually really curious why the 2021 is higher than 2020, but they're relatively the same. It's just decimals. So I guess if you're going to compare the lore consumption score, quote unquote, of the different generations of Genshin Impact players, these are the numbers that you're gonna get. Obviously, the 2024 is gonna be lower, but it's surprisingly not as low as I thought it would be. This is a very big factor too. If you're going to do quantitative analysis, I would just like to warn you that your N, or like the number of how your sample is distributed over the categories, may or may not have significant issues. But this, on the other hand, I can, because it passed the 0.005 test. And this showing up to me, by the way, was really interesting that it was all just 2.17. And I was like, was there a bug in my computer? No, it just turns out that people mostly just consume the condensed versions from the internet. And this is a significant testing, which means that, yes, the index of secondary consumption versus primary consumption of the Genshin Impact population is basically the same. It's basically higher. And then we move on to the difference in medium types. So the difference in distribution between everyone else. Everyone was relatively the same except for the world quests. These numbers don't really tell you who contributed the most to what, but the difference of a 4.8, I don't know like why there's a difference, but so world quests was one of them. Another one was web events lore. I think it's because older players tend to have more experience with web events. They didn't implement the web events button in the actual menu or in the game until much later, so that's interesting. Another one is event live streams. There's a significant difference in distribution when it comes to event live streams for some reason. And then online discussions also has a significant difference, so I have no idea why that's the case. And then they also have a difference in short form content. So that's just interesting. I don't know why that's the case. Obviously, like, the numbers need interpretation, but these are the sources that have a significant difference between the groups, which is web events lore, artifact lore, short form, event live stream, and online discussions. Maybe it's because of exposure? Next is lore attitudes. So I define lore attitudes as general opinions, perceived knowledge, and perceived efficacy. So for example, do you believe that if you know more lore, it's gonna enhance your gameplay? Or are you just okay with not knowing the lore? Or do you think that lore is a supplement rather than a necessity? Something like that. I started with perceived knowledge. Now, if you did the survey, I asked you, how knowledgeable are you of 5 different topics? And the reason that I picked those topics was because they were diverse, but they were general enough that even if you didn't play the deeper stories of Genshin Impact, if the general population is confident, or how do they perceive their knowledgeability about these topics? So for this one, people agreed somewhat that they were generally knowledgeable. And then the next one is the Marijavari, which is a Mondstadt topic. The next one is the Sun Children of Enkanomiya, so we're taking on Inazuman topics here. People are generally knowledgeable about them. I think this has a higher number than the Marijavari because of the world quests. So that's another very good point to make. Then the next one we have is the Kingdom of Remoria, which surprisingly a lot of people confidently say that they don't know anything about. And then in the next one is obviously the Fatui Harbingers. Everyone knows them, and everyone is confident in their knowledge about the Fatui Harbingers, which is very, very valid. And then we move on to just the general perceived knowledge of everything in Genshin. So the first one is this one, where they said that they were relatively knowledgeable enough. It kind of tapered off in the middle. If you were to draw a curve, it would be a pretty normal distribution. And then I asked them about their confidence about it, and people were pretty confident about their own, so I guess it does line up with the previous one, which is, well, makes sense. If it didn't, I'd be really shocked. And then the next one is we have just general opinions about the lore, honestly. And the one is I asked, do they think if Genshin lore is easily understood? A lot of people disagreed with me. And then the next one is Genshin lore beyond the Arcane Quest is required to enjoy the game. Do you think that you're required to learn everything about Genshin lore? So a lot of people disagreed. So the numbers, like, most people disagree, but there's actually a good chunk of people that also agree with this statement that it is required for people to go beyond the Arcane Quest and to explore the world of Tivat. Then the next one is they're interested in learning about Genshin Impact's lore beyond the primary quests and limited events. Now this is more of an introspective thing. So some people disagreed, but a lot of people actually strongly agreed. And then we have, there are certain lore topics that I want to know more of and others that I will disregard. Genshin lore is massive, and there are always going to be some times where you do not care enough about everything. A lot of people agreed with this, and honestly, I personally agree with this. I'm a fan of skirmish lore, Fatui Harbinger lore. And then the next one is, I am interested in staying updated with lore updates. Because Genshin lore is constantly changing, it also fights itself in a way, like it makes its own self-corrections. So a lot of people strongly agree, and relatively speaking, the attitudes towards Genshin lore have been positive, except for some criticisms there. And then the next one is, I am satisfied with only reading lore from primary voice content such as AQs, event story quests, and character requests. Because, well, according to the previous statistics that we found, these are the most prevalent sources of information for the average Genshin Impact player. People actually disagreed with this. I was really pleasantly surprised that a lot of people disagreed with this statement, and more so are neutral, which does make sense because a lot of people are interested in staying with lore updates as lore, so it would make sense why this sample size is at the very least not interested in just condemning themselves into the arcane quests and stuff like that. I also wanted to ask if there was a correlation between lore consumption and lore attitude. So the higher your lore consumption, the higher your lore attitudes. And I wanted to know like how much. And I'm pleasantly surprised that there was a significant positive, strong correlation between lore consumption and lore attitudes. And the next one is lore dissemination. How do you share the information that you learn from Genshin Impact with other people? So I gave, I think, 6 examples of this. So number 1 was discuss with immediate friends and colleagues regarding Genshin lore. I was going to say personal, but like, ugh. And then we have discuss in online forums and platforms. So I included Twitter here, which is occasionally, sometimes, and never, which is really interesting because I don't know if a lot of people considered Twitter as an online platform or forum for this one, but the fact that this surprisingly has a higher than immediate friends just means that people tend to like go into close groups when it comes to lore, which is really interesting. This one was very interesting to me that there was a disparity. Number 3 was created fan content, fan art, and fan fiction in regards to Genshin lore. So these are the more tangible expressions of your interest in lore, and a lot of people said never. Obviously, it takes a bit more dedication to actually do fan content, and a lot of people said never to this question. And posted any videos of any kind, there is a whopping 92.9%, and I always wonder who these 23 people are. Next is creative theories and speculation about Genshin Impact lore. I'm glad to see that a lot of people are relatively interested in expanding their interpretation of Genshin Impact lore, because a lot of them said sometimes, often, and always. But is there a significant correlation between lore consumption and lore dissemination? Yes. There is a significant positive, moderate, or strong correlation between lore consumption and lore attitudes. I wasn't thinking that this number was going to be as high as it was. That people consume the lore and then they actively go around and talk to people about it. Even if it's just to your immediate friends, that's really interesting, honestly. The fact that it was significant is really nice. And then there's also a positive correlation between lore attitudes and lore disseminations. If you have strong opinions or you have higher perceived knowledge on how you treat the lore, or you have a more positive outlook on the lore, obviously you're more inclined to share it with other people. And that's basically it. Thank you all so much for watching, and that was a long Ooh, that was truly one of the surveys of all time. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. This was a lot of work, but at the very least, I was very happy that I was able to share it with you guys, and that you guys all, I guess, went with me through this endeavor of knowing if Genshin Impact's fans read. So my final notes about this. The lore consumption of an average Genshin Impact player is relatively high if you consider all of the sources of lore, and that includes monster lore, artifact lore, and the more obscure ones hidden away. And secondary sources like YouTube videos and shorts are more preferred by the fan base, which has its own kind of problems. While it's nice to have condensed versions of the medium that you're consuming, those secondary sources do have interpretations. For example, my theory videos have my own interpretations, and the fact that those are perpetuated more inside of the source material being looked at is going to form some perceptions that weren't intended by the creator themselves. But the limitation of this survey is that the actual phrase Genshin Impact fans don't read doesn't just come from the fact that they don't consume, but that many interpretations that are objectively wrong exist around Genshin Impact fandom. And that's something that you can't exactly survey on. How do you read Genshin Impact lore? Maybe in the future I'm going to try another methodology, maybe a more qualitative interpretation of this, most likely for textual analysis. I'm thinking if that's an okay methodology, because while for this one I'm trying to think of the relationships of the numbers of what we actually consume as a fan base, if I'm going to be diving into the more human aspect, I think a textual analysis of what is actually being said by people is very important, and how we interpret the lore that we consume. And if that's too much to ask, God help us all. But that's it for me today. Bye-bye!